right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. And chapter 11, of course, we call it the letter to the Hebrews. Nowhere in the letter is that actually written, but for convenience sake, we call it the letter to the Hebrews. If you remember last week, right, we talked about a few things last week. One of the main examples that I gave was that Hebrews 10 was like a huge door that is swinging on a hinge. And so through chapters 1 through 10, the preacher, the author of this letter, has been exploring the identity and the character and the purpose of Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. He's explored his deity, the fact that he is God. He's explored his humanity, that he is human. Guys, shh. The fact that he is human. The author has explored the meaning of Jesus' death on the cross, his death for the sins of the world, and how Jesus conquered death through the resurrection. Our author has been exploring how Jesus was the high priest for all of humanity, that he stands in to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves as compromised human beings. And so we have Hebrews 10 now, opening the door to something new. Hebrews 10 explores every angle that you can possibly imagine, sort of combining all of those things together. So last week we came to the hinge of that door at the end of Hebrews chapter 10. And the author kind of gets in our face and he says, if this is in fact who Jesus is, and this is in fact what he's done, the question is, how will you respond? And that door swings on its hinge now, instead of talking just about Jesus, to pointing back to us. In the final three chapters now, Hebrews 11, 12, and 13, which please remind me, we need to think about what's next and we want to study next after Hebrews. Chapters 11, 12, and 13, the author of Hebrews now is challenging us to respond to Jesus. If he is those things, what does that mean for us? What are you going to do? What is an appropriate response to this reality of Jesus? To the divine and the human priest who has offered his life in self-giving love for us, for our forgiveness, and for the remaking of us, for the remaking of our hearts and our minds, to make us into new kinds of human beings. How should we respond? That's the point of the end of chapter 10 and into 11 now. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time, in chapter 10 and verse 35. Let's read there. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. And then he quotes two ancient Hebrew prophets here, the prophets Isaiah, and I don't remember the other one, if it's from Isaiah also, I don't remember. Let's read verse 36 through 39 now. 37. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So let's look at what he's doing here. He's making a challenge here, right? Jesus has accomplished what he came to accomplish. He has, our author here has mapped that out in chapters 1 through 10, and he gives us a future hope now. Jesus has done what he's done, and here's what it means for the future. And if Jesus says he is if he is what he says he is, he's not just done something in the past. He's going to do something for us in the future. And what does it say here in verse 37? For yet a little while, and the coming one will come, and he will not delay. He says the coming one will come, and he will not delay. What's that? What's the author talking about here? Well, he's referring to the return of Jesus. And the whole of chapters 1 through 10 is talking about the past accomplishments of Jesus, right? Now he's talking about the future return of Jesus. And while we're in the present, we wait for Jesus' return, right? Where he comes to remake and renew all things. Kind of like our bodies we were talking about. They're going to be remade and renewed. And so we look back to Jesus' accomplishment and what he accomplished on the cross and what he accomplished in the resurrection. And we look forward to his return. And what is the mark then? What is the mark in the lives of God's people in this in-between time? The time we now live in, after the cross but before the resurrection. What's supposed to be marking our hearts, in our minds, in our lives? What does he say? My righteous one will live by faith. Faith is kind of one of those religious words, right? That we use a lot, maybe, or that gets often thrown around, and we don't actually know what it means frequently. It's kind of a murky concept for many of us, and that has to do with some bad theology that's out there, but we'll get through that this morning. This morning, though, we're going to move right towards what the meaning of this word is. Whatever you think faith is, it's not just like some belief in some abstract religious idea. Right? Christian faith, especially faith here as it's talked about in the book of Hebrews, is about life. Life in the in-between time, in between the resurrection and the second coming, right? After the cross and the resurrection, but before Jesus' return. Faith in promises. He has accomplished his purposes. He's going to be faithful and bring them to completion. We live by faith. In the meantime, in the present, we live by faith. Welcome to Hebrews chapter 11. That's all about faith, right? So we have a number of words in English for faith. Jonah, can you turn the heater until it turns off, please? We have a number of varied words in English for faith. We have faith, right? We have belief, we have trust, and I think most of these words, right, faith or belief, we primarily tend to think of what? Some sort of mental activity, right? Something that happens in our head, right? It's referring to something that we think. Quick question here. Does Hebrews 11 describe a people group who are sitting around thinking? And the answer is obviously no. These people got up and did things. Hebrews chapter 11 is describing how God's people live and make choices, terribly difficult choices, when they're in dire straits, when they're in distress. Faith is linked to endurance during those times. And it's also linked to hope, right? And so what I want to do this morning, what I want to do, especially now, is that I want to sit in and stew on and dwell in this definition of faith that the author is going to begin with here in verse 1. Let me read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is about experiencing reality. And this is where I'm going to diverge from popular level Christianity in America today. Faith is not something that I believe in my heart. Faith is about a reality around us that we can experience, that exists, that is true. That we're getting a taste of the thing that we hope for in the future because of the promises that are coming true and have come true now. And so, contrary to popular belief, faith is not the rejection of thinking and reasoning. Right? Biblical faith begins in our minds, but the result is commitment. The result is radical action in response to what God has done for us. And there are several translations here to Hebrews chapter 1. Let me grab a different version here and turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, Now faith is the reality. Does anybody have anything different? The ESV says assurance. Confidence is another version. The reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. I really like this translation. It follows an older tradition starting in the King James. And so, if we read the ESV, remember we were talking about different translations this morning? If we read the ESV, now faith is the assurance. Where is assurance? Is it external to me or internal? Where do I feel it? Where do I experience the assurance? Internally, for the most part. I'm not saying it's not external, but for the most part, it's internal. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction. Where do I have convictions? In jail? Maybe. But in my heart, right? I think about the convictions. This sounds like faith is in my heart and is inside of me. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I am saying is it's probably actually not the best translation of the Greek. So I don't tend to try and correct Bible translators, but this is a very difficult passage to decide how to translate, and lots of translators have gone different directions with this. And so my point here is that with the ESV, we walk away with the idea that faith is about some sort of inner disposition inside of me, right? It's about an inner state. Not that we have inner states in Sitka. It's about a feeling. It's about a mindset I get myself into, right? That somehow I just need to muster up this confidence, right? That God said what he said, and so my response would be to believe it and find ways to make myself believe it. I'm going to tell you right now that's not correct. That is not the correct outcome of reading this passage. If we read the King James or any modern contemporary version, they will opt for a more literal translation of those words. Faith is the substance, the King James says. The Christian Standard here says the reality. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for. The evidence of things not seen. That sounds different than something that's in my heart. That sounds like something that is external to me. So, in other words, our faith is not this inner feeling that we have a mindset or that we just pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and continue on in, right? Faith is an experience. And when you have this faith experience, you actually begin to taste the reality. You don't get the whole thing right now. You don't get the whole cookie right now. But here, you get a taste of what it is that you're hoping for. Are those two things different? Yes. They're totally different. And how do we feel about that? Well, I would say, welcome to the wonderful world of Bible translation and interpretation. Because things are hard. Life is hard, and life is not easy. And we need to remember that the scriptures are a divine word from God, but they are also what? A human word. Spoken by humans, written down by humans, translated by humans. And so whenever we're opening the Bible, I know this is hard for us to remember because we encounter it in English, right? But we're crossing over a cultural boundary line. It's like when we're getting on a plane and flying to another country. That's what it's, and we step off the plane and it's 108 degrees and there's sand all around us, right? We're in a different part of the world. Faith is the hypo. What does hypo mean? Something elevated? Hypoglycemia? Got too much blood sugar? Faith is the hypostasis of what is hoped for. It is the elenka, or elenkos, of what is not seen. I worked through every commentary that I could get my hands on, and most of them agree that the best arguments are for the second translation that I gave to you, not from the ESV, but that faith is the reality of things hoped for, the proof, the evidence for what is not seen. And this does not need to scandalize us, right, in any sort of way. This is why I encourage people to read more than one translation. So maybe I should just skip to the bottom line here of what this means. In other words, right? In other words, therefore, faith is faith is a mindset. It is something that is going on inside of you. But it's also about this assurance and this experience that you live in. And so the author of Hebrews wants us to say something more than just what's inside of us. He wants to tell us that faith opens up for us an experience, or it opens up for us the ability to participate in a real experience, an authentic experience, to taste the things that we have hoped for. So it's not that you just talk yourself up. I believe, I believe, I believe. I have more faith. Right? That's not what's happening. But you actually come to experience the evidence of faith. You come to experience the evidence of it and act in the act of faith. And that's something that seems very abstract, right? So maybe I should illustrate, and I'm kind of cheating because I'm repurposing an example that I used previously. And no, it's not the mechanic and his robes in the temple, in the shop. This is something that is very pertinent to Sitka. And I didn't go check, but I would be willing to bet this is happening right now in Sitka, even though there's snow on the ground. Jeanette and I moved down here from up north, right? Where it's much colder than here. Right? So by the time March comes along, which is about February now, that March it's kind of a wash, right? Because you'll get a 35 or 40 degree day that might seem cold, right? But in Alaska, after 4.5 months of winter, right? 35, 40 degrees feels balmy, kind of like right now, right? In mid-February here in Sitka. And so I'm not kidding you. When we get into late March and in the upper 30s, people are walking around wearing flip-flops and t-shirts. And I'm one of them. And they're, I mean, it's totally just breaking it out because it's, you know, when you've been stuck inside all winter, right? Because we're stuck inside doing whatever it is that Alaskans do all winter, right? So 35 degrees comes, and it's this great exodus of everybody showing off their summer wardrobe again. And it's ridiculous because why? Because it's cold out and you know it's going to snow again. It's 30 degrees outside. I mean, all it has to dip is 5 degrees and it's going to start snowing. And so we can't wait to break out our t-shirts and flip-flops. We know that spring is coming because it's 35 degrees outside. It's not 10 below anymore, right? And I promise this is going to connect back to Hebrews. And it's something that became or has become very beautiful and symbolic to me. And I've used this illustration before, I've said. So those 40-degree days in March, they produce something out of the ground. Come springtime, what is the first flower to bloom? You can answer. Oh yeah, Sherry. Yeah, huh? The snowdrop. What? Anybody know what this one is? No, not fireweed. The crocus. Yes, the crocus. The crocus flower is the first one to bloom, especially here in Sitka. And here is what is great about the crocus. It's small, right? It's tiny. It's beautiful, but we all know. Maybe the crocus doesn't know, but we all know it's going to snow again. Even after the crocus flower peeks out its little head and blooms, it can't stop the snow from coming, right? And so you end up with beautiful little postcards like this of flowers poking out through the snow. And there's these little crocus flowers everywhere. And there's something about looking at this crocus flower that has become symbolic for me. Because we know that winter is passing, right? Winter is not eternal, even though it feels like it by the end of the 4th month and the 4.5 month and maybe even the 5th month, right? It feels eternal. But I can look at this flower and it motivates me to put on a t-shirt in 35 degrees because I know that summer is coming, right? Do you see where this is going? I'm going with this metaphor. When I put on a t-shirt in that 40-degree day in late March, in early April up north, it's even later, it's April up north, what am I doing? I'm getting a little taste. I'm actually beginning to experience the faith. I'm getting to experience by faith the thing that I will experience fully when summer comes. And if you think of that I'm crazy for wearing a t-shirt on a 40-degree day, what can I point to? The crocus flower. And I can say, spring and summer, it's coming. And so it seems to me that this is something that the author of Hebrews is trying to tell us. He's trying to get at something, that faith. Yes, it's a mindset, but it's actually an experience that you have when you obey. And so when you follow Jesus in a way that makes no sense, in light of your present surroundings, in the community, in the city that you live in, when you live in a way that makes no sense to everybody else, but makes sense in light of the future that you know is coming, that is faith. The way that these people lived in Hebrews chapter 11, the way these people lived, as we read the stories, their behavior makes no sense in light of their present circumstances, right? In fact, the acts of faith of many of these people end up getting them what? End up getting them killed and tortured. But they could point to evidence that God would be faithful to bring about his promises, right? And what is the crocus flower in the story and the theology of the New Testament? What is the blooming flower that reminds us, that points to what is to come? It's the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. It's the sign that God has conquered death. And more than one time, it's used as a metaphor of a seed being put into the earth that is blooming, that when it comes up, it's something different. Yes, it is the seed that you put in the ground, but when it comes up, it's something different. It's a new life. It's a sign that God has conquered death and is bringing that new life. It's also the foundation of our faith. And so faith is not just a mindset of, faith is not just a mindset. And we're going to see that as we continue on in our lesson. So let's dive in here, and we're going to see some examples from Hebrews chapter 11. I think for time, I'm just going to cut it down to just Abraham here. But Hebrews chapter 11, faith is actually acting in such a way that I participate in the substance and the reality of it, of what will fully come out in the future. And so the way that these people lived, as we read their stories, their behavior makes no sense when you look at their circumstances. In fact, the acts of faith of these people end up getting them tortured, right? Somehow I had that slide doubled up. I don't know what's going on there. This kind of faith, this Christian faith, begins with engaging our minds. This is not a blind leap into the dark. It begins with thinking and reasoning, yes, but it doesn't end there. It actually ends with real and radical commitment and action that shows that I actually believe what God says. I actually believe what God is going to do, that he's going to do what he says he's going to do. Let's look at verse 17. Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Faith is actually acting in a way that I participate in the substance of reality, of what will fully come about in the future. So let's follow this here. So God has made a promise to Abraham, right, that a great nation was going to come through him. It was going to be through his seed and through his offspring, right? And all nations were going to be blessed through him. And so the promised child is going to come, and Sarah is listed, the second one on the list here. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth one on the list here is Sarah, believing in God's promise that her faith was counted to her. And she received the power to conceive. So God has made this promise through Abraham, and this promised child's going to come, right? And so he has that promise now. And then he has this reality in his other hand that somehow God is asking him to give up the very son through whom the promise is going to come true. Is that a contradiction? Yes. It is okay to say there is contradictions in the Bible. Sometimes they are more of an apparent contradiction, right? This is an apparent contradiction in the life of somebody who is following God. I see God's promises here. I have them in my hand. His name is Isaac. And what I see here, I see what God says here. And I can't put these two things together. I can't see how he's going to be the namesake of many generations if I kill him, if I offer him on this altar. How do these two things go together? And so what does Abraham do? Well, what's the next thing Abraham does? The NIV says he reasoned. He engaged his mind. He considered, the ESV says. And you begin to do the math and you say, okay, well, I know that God is going to fulfill his promises in some way, and that seems to contradict the experience of having to offer my son. And so what does he do? He reasons. He takes. He engages his mind and begins to work out the problem. He doesn't shut off his mind and say, faith, right? That's not what happens. That God he must be able to raise Isaac from the dead, he reasons. Which, the word says, figuratively speaking, he did. And so he knew that somehow God was going to work out his promises. And that contradiction would resolve itself if he was just patient and he thought those things through. And that's the theme here in Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to skip over the rest of these people here. I didn't have them all listed, but that if you go through and you read it again, the author is going to highlight numerous times where God's people sat down and thought, and they reasoned. And that is very significant, right? Because faith is not the absence of thinking things through. Oh, I just need to believe, and that'll carry me through. That's not what the author here says that faith is. Faith begins with that process of believing in God, yes. And that's very counterintuitive for most of us, right? Because maybe we have a version of religious faith, or maybe we have some sort of idea of that religious faith is what you have when you have no evidence, right? That faith is what you have when there's no reason to believe. Sometimes I've heard that. That is wrong. The preacher here, the author of Hebrews, says just the opposite of that. That faith is what you have when you know there is good reason to believe. That there is good reason to believe that God is going to do what he said he was going to do. To believe in something when there is no good evidence, when there's not a shred of reason or evidence to believe in it, that's not faith. That's stupidity. Come on. If there's no good reason, why would you believe it? Right? That doesn't make any sense at all. But that's what we're told by the outside world about Christianity. That you believe in things that there's no evidence for. That is incorrect. There is lots of good evidence. The reason we believe chapter 10 and verse 37, the reason we believe that the coming one will come is because we can point to something as proof. We have a crocus flower to point to, right? Because look, it's right there. There it is. It still looks like winter all around me. There's snow on the ground. There's still snow outside, right? There's ice still, at least. But there's the crocus flower. It's there. And based off of that evidence, I can engage. I need to rethink my circumstances. I can reason. I can engage my mind. Do you see where I'm going with this here? This is not just, there's no reason for you to believe in these things, but you just need to have faith. That's not what's happening. There are reasons to believe. And so there's a whole bunch of us here. We were talking about this in the class, about questioning. There's a whole bunch of us here who are wired with a personality and brains that just don't quit. They just keep going and going, and we just keep asking questions, and we struggle, and we see what the scripture says about God, or we see what the gospel claims about Jesus and his resurrection, and then we see things happening in our own world. Nobody else is getting up from the dead, right? Or we see our own life experiences. And we're like, how do these two things go together? And so we struggle. And we struggle hard with questions. And there's nothing more frustrating than sharing those struggles with other Christians and getting the response that maybe you just need to tone it down a little bit, right? You bring those questions down a little bit. You just need to believe. You just need to have faith. That is hogwash. Hogwash. Jesus is the exact imprint. He is the hypostasis, the exact imprint of God's reality. Chapter 11, verse 1, he is the reality of what is hoped for. And the writer of Hebrews here, he wants us to see that. He wants us to be the focus of our faith. This real thing that happened, Jesus, is an objective reality. Right? It's not a wish. He's not a hope. He's not a good moral story. This is a full reality of God that is revealed in a human being. Right? That's why we can be so confident. It's what he did. It's not our poor performance. But we put our faith in him. And our faith is real then. If this is not just something inside of us, our faith is real. Because God has incarnated. He has become human. He came. He lived a life. He died on the cross. He was raised in the resurrection. He is our high priest. He is the sacrifice. And faith is a demonstration of the existence of that reality. That Jesus is the objective reality of God and the proof of God. Jesus is the object. It is the basis of our faith. It is the evidence, chapter 11, verse 1, of our faith. And so I don't believe in Jesus because I can just muster up some sort of inner feeling or disposition that I make myself. That's not what faith is. I believe what I believe because something happened 2,000 years ago, right? Has the crocus flower bloomed? Yes. Jesus came, he lived, he died, he rose from the dead, and that is the foundation of our faith. That's what makes God faithful to us. That even when he was rejected, he was faithful. And the question is that really true? Is that really believable? And if it is, I need to engage my mind and consider God faithful for what's to come in the future. There are some of us here who might not be a Christian. And my challenge to you would be to consider the claims of the gospel. We're not gathering around a superstition here. If that were the case, I promise you, I would have checked out a long time ago. We're coming around the gospel because we're convinced that it is actually true. And if Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead, then the world is I promise you, the world is a lot stranger place than you thought it was than when you woke up this morning, when you finally make that realization. And that there are things that are possible and things that are true and that perhaps you didn't realize could be possible or could be true. And so the challenge to you would be to consider these claims, the truth claims of the gospel. Ask them, challenge them, question them, because I promise you will find them to be true. If you find them to be true, the question is, what will you do about it? Because you don't have that hope of living with God eternally unless you put your loyalty, your trust, your faith in Jesus. If you don't put to death the old man of sin, bury him in the waters of baptism, and come up a new creature, you aren't part of that new family. And for the rest of us, if we call ourselves Christians, right? Hebrews 11 has something to tell us. Hebrews 11 really delivers a punch to the gut for us. And here's how I would put the question to us. Can you identify an area in your own life that makes no sense? That makes no sense in light of your surroundings? Can you identify a behavior or an obedience in you to God that makes no sense in light of your present circumstances around you, that can only be explained because of your faith, that can only be explained by where God is taking this broken world by forgiveness? Is it an area of finances? Is it an area of generosity? Is it an area of how you treat other people? Do our lives show the marks of that faith, of radical commitment? That we live in the present, but we live in the present as if the future has already arrived in Jesus, right? Can I think of one area in my life where I'm following that type of risky, that radical faith? Not blind, not ignorant faith, but a risky, radical faith. Can we identify those things? And if not, we need to take those radical steps in our own lives to live as if the gospel is true. And that's the lesson from Hebrews chapter 11. Next week, I think we will actually get into some of the examples, and so we'll spend another week on Hebrews chapter 11. It's good to see everybody here this morning. We'll see you all next week.